Hey lighting people, let's talk about my workflow in programming with recipes, and specifically, because this is something I've been asked to talk about, how my Stomp presets work. Now, when I program cues out, I like to get really granular with what I'm doing. I like to put really specific values in that are going to give me like exactly the right look and feel, right? There's no point in programming cues if I'm not getting really granular with it. I'll just run it all on the fly because I can do it just as well. If I'm just doing like 5 effects, I can do that on the fly, right? So if I'm programming cues, I want to have a lot of different options for different values that I can use. When you're working with recipes, you can't just choose a value. You can't be like, okay, I want to put my dimmer at 55 right now because that looks right, and put that in the programmer. You have to have a preset for it already. So when I created my presets, it was kind of a lot of work, but it was so worth it in the long run because this workflow made my programming so much faster than any other workflow I have ever found. It took a little bit to get used to working with the recipe editor, but honestly, it was not that hard. It was just as soon as I got used to it and as soon as I actually had everything laid out the way I needed it to be, programming was so fast. I mean, probably twice as fast as any other workflow I'd found for programming, and still able to get as detailed. So let's talk about how my recipe presets are set up. So over here on the computer, I have my Stomp view pulled up. Now, the way I have my view set up is I have this presets button right here, which I can access from either screen. I usually keep it on the right-hand screen on the console. I use an MA3 Compact XT. And I have my main presets here for tilt, beam, gobo, focus. And I don't typically do a ton of different effects on these, right? So all of these actually do stomp or actually the tilt ones don't. The fan ones will stomp any phasers that I have running. They have a relative 0 baked in, but these are just for my main position. So I'll change this, I'll change this, I'll change this, I'll change this. All of these things on this screen have to do with setting my primary look for the song, right? So I'm coming in, I'm going to program a song. This is why this is my main screen. It's because when I'm making a look, I'm starting off, I want, okay, how are my lights going to be positioned? What beam, what gobo, what zoom values and focus, and then what color, right? I choose these values. None of these are recipe presets because I don't need them to be. These are just plain values. I select my lights, I select a preset, that becomes a recipe since I program in recipes. So I select the lights, select this, change anything I need to in my recipe editor, and store it in the queue. Now I have my look for the song. These presets for the position and focus do have default fade times stored into them as well. This is one of the keys that makes programming so much faster. Again, I like to get granular with fade times and things, but a lot of the time, like 90% of the time, my position and focus are going to need to fade in a certain amount of time, right? So I have a default fade value programmed into these presets. And then once I click the preset, it'll fade in that time by default. If I want to change it, I can change it, but I don't have to change it, right? So for the 90% of cases where I want it to fade in that time, like that's the most common time that I use, right? That's why I picked it. I don't have to change anything. So I just select the preset, I'm done. I don't have to give it a fade time. The zoom ones is 3 seconds. So most of the time I want zooms to happen in 3 seconds. On the rare occasion when it's something different, I change it. Now, for programming with phasers, I have relative pan tilt phasers of different values, and so I'll select one of these. Again, it has a default fade time programmed in. For a while, I was doing some dim relative phasers on my washes. I don't do that anymore, but when I did, I would use these. So I have basically a section here for sine dimmers, a section here for pops, and a section here for when they pop on and then fade off, which is one of my favorite effects. So these are recipe presets. All of my phasers are. These are referencing another preset somewhere that just has the values in. So you have to think through, what can I change in the recipe editor? And then make default values for the things that are changeable there for what you use most often, but then have a separate preset for everything that you can't change in the recipe editor. So that way you can select the values that you can't change, what you want in a preset, and then it already has customized what you're most likely to use for the things that you can change, but then you can change those, right? I hope that makes sense. So I've got that for all my dim relatives. Then I have these 3 zoom effects. I don't use zoom effects very often. That's why I mean, there's also not a ton of different values you can use. So I have these 3 options. Then, let's see, I'll go to Stomp last. So this is my main absolute dimmers page. This is a lot, right? So the reason why I have so many different ones, again, is because you have to have a lot of different options, but specifically because my pixel bars in the back they're really, really bright. So I can only use them up to like 20% brightness because they're pointing right at the audience. So I need to have values that are really low, and then to have different levels, I have to have a lot more presets. So my pixel bars in the back, I have 0 to 5, 0 to 8, 0 to 10, 0 to 13, 0 to 17, 0 to 20. And then I have 1 to some of these, 3 to some of these, because I need those. Now, I don't have this many different options for all of the forms. So these different columns are kind of different forms. And my sine waves, my pops, my pop-ons, and then these ones fade on and pop off. And then I have my regular different values for the other ones. All of these presets are recipe presets with a reference to a universal preset containing the values, but then this has the default values for each group of fixtures that I would use. So my floor pixels references the preset, shuffle, default fade time of 3 seconds, speed of 10 BPM, phase 0 to 360. Then I have my air pixels, has different values, different speed, basically everything else is pretty much the same. My all spots, again, different speed, washes, different speed. So every kind of fixture group has default values stored in here so that I already have the right speed. I have my shuffle and 0 to 360 phase in there when I click on it. Then if I want to change those things specific to the cue in the recipe editor, I can quickly change just what I want to. But my default values are baked into the preset. So I've got all of these different ones here. Another thing that I love to do is relative color phasers. So just increasing and decreasing the saturation. Again, these are the same kind of thing where they're referencing a universal preset, but then each group of lights that does it, which for these, it only works on the spots and the washes. So I just have it for the spots and the washes. I have them programmed in here with the default values that I want for that. And so I do saturation pops sometimes. I love that. And then just a sine wave. And again, I can click on these, customize whatever I want, and that's it. I have rainbows here, and then these are all just kind of random things that were specific for specific projects. So to my Stomp presets, and I got somebody specifically asking me about how I had these set up before, so I hope I can answer all the questions that arise about these. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what all needs to be explained, but I'm going to explain it to the best of my ability. So I have a default all preset here, which I use at the beginning of my songs so that all of the lights have a value, a base value for like every attribute that I use. The reason is so that I can turn on off when overridden, and when I switch songs, it's going to off the other songs. Now, I use that. That just kind of resets everything, right? Then I have my different levels of dimmer stops, and these are, again, these ones probably don't need to be recipe presets, but they are referencing a universal phaser, and they are giving me just a default fade time, basically. And so I'll click on it, and it'll default fade in 3 seconds to that value. I have a dim stomp relative, which I don't program relative values anymore, but it's useful to have in case I need it, right? It's just stomp relative 0. I never want dimmer to be relative any other value. Pan tilt stomp relative just stomps pan and tilt to relative. Again, I have a default fade time in here. It's a different value for each of these. I guess I have it to 9 seconds for pan. It's probably 5 or 7 for tilt. Yep, it's 7. So that's kind of the optimal number of seconds that I found I most often like for those stomps to happen. And then I have a whole bunch of options for relative values for my RGB, because I like to saturate and desaturate my fixtures based on relative values so that I can change my main color for the song and not have to change every cue that has a difference in saturation. Saturation changes are great, obviously, for building, like making a difference between big parts and low parts of the song. So I do my saturation variation phasers, and then I also sometimes will stomp to a desaturated version of the color or something. So I have all those options. Again, I don't use all of these, but because I'm programming in recipes, I need to have all of these in case I need to use them. So I have all that set up that way for that reason. Now, another thing I've done for my programming is, again, I'm using the recipe editor, right? So I'll select a group of lights, and then I will click on a preset, maybe a dimmer preset. Then I have these in MAtricks. So you do kind of have to play with it and figure out how the recipe editor works for you and your presets. But my default is just a plain shuffle. Maybe I want to have it do an odd even. Maybe I want to have it do blocks of 4 pixels at a time. That's a common one that I do. So I've created some in MAtricks that I use a lot, and I can click on this and then further customize it in the recipe editor if I want to. But these in MAtricks do contain all of the data that I need for default for that. So maybe this one isn't the best example. I'll go with this one. So odd even, I do have to have it set up properly on the selection grid to use this, but I have it set to do a Y group of 2. Phase from Y, phase to Y is set in here, so that when I click on this, it's already set to the default for what I want from that in MAtrix in the recipe editor, and if I want to change it, I can change it. I hope all of that makes sense. It might not make so much sense if you don't understand how the recipe editor works already. I did make some videos on using that. So if that's something that interests you, be sure to check that out. And also, if you have any further questions about my workflow or how recipes work, let me know and I can make another video. Have a good week and happy programming.